Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Radha Gopinath, Radha Gopinath, Shri Radhe. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajacharya Ashtadhara Sata Sata Shri Srimati Divine Grace of Bhaichand Aravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai Shri Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan Ki Jai Jai Nitai Gaur Premanande Ribo. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Cheva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudidayet Nashta Prayeshu Abhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtaki Krishnaya Vasudevaya Devaki Nandanaya cha Nanda Gopakumaraya Govindaya Namo Namaha. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto number 3, chapter number 6, text number 34. Chapter entitled Creation of the Universal Form. Ete varna swadharmena Ete varna sadharmena yajanti swagurum harim yajanti swagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhartam Yajjata sahavrittibihi Yajjata sahavrittibihi Ete varna swadharmena Yajanti swagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhartam Yajjata sahavrittibihi Ete varna swadharmena Yajanti swagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhyartam Yajjata sahavrittibihi
Ete varna swadharmena yajanti swagurum harim Yajanti swagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhyartam Yajjata sahavrittibihi Ete varna swadharmena Yajanti swagurum harim
Yajanti swagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhyartam Yajjata sahavrittibihi. Word for word, ete, all these, varnaha, orders of society, swadharmena, one by one's own occupational duties, yajanti, worship, swagurum, with the spiritual master, harim, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Shraddhaya, with faith and devotion, Atma, self, Vishuddhyartam, for purifying, Yat, from whom, Jataha, born, Saha, along with, Vittibihi, occupational duty. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace Abhay Charnaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada, Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation: all these different social divisions are born with their occupational duties and living conditions from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus, for unconditional life and self-realization, one has to worship the Supreme Lord under the direction of the Spiritual Master. Purport: since they are born from different parts of the body of the Supreme Lord in His gigantic form, all living entities in all parts of the universe are supposed to be eternal servitors of the Supreme Body. Every part of our own body, such as the mouth, hands, legs and thighs, is meant to render service to the whole. That is their constitutional position. In subhuman life, the living entities are not conscious of this constitutional position, but in the human form of life, they are supposed to know this through the system of the varnas, the social orders. As above mentioned, the Brahmana is the spiritual master of all the orders of society, and thus Brahminical culture, culminating in the transcendental service of the Lord, is the basic principle for purifying the soul. In conditioned life, the soul is under the impression that he can become the Lord of the universe, and the last point of this misconception is to think oneself the Supreme. The foolish, conditioned soul does not take into account that the Supreme cannot be conditioned by Maya or illusion. If the Supreme were to become conditioned by illusion, where would be His supremacy? In that case, Maya or illusion would be the Supreme. Therefore, because the living entities are conditioned, they cannot be Supreme. The actual position of the conditioned soul is explained in this verse. All the conditioned souls are impure due to contact with the material energy in three modes of nature. Therefore, it is necessary that they purify themselves under the guidance of the bona fide spiritual master, who is not only a Brahmana by qualification, but must also be a Vaishnava. The only self-purifying process mentioned herein is to worship the Lord under the recognized method, under the guidance of the bona fide spiritual master. That is the natural way of purification, and no other method is recommended as bona fide. The other methods of purification may be helpful to come to this stage of life, but ultimately one has to come to this point. Ultimately, one has to come to this last point before he attains actual perfection. Bhagavad Gita 7:19 confirms this truth as follows: Bahunam janmanam mante jnanavan mam prapadyate vasudeva sarvamiti sa mahatma sudurlabha. Translation again: all these different social divisions are born with their occupational duties and living conditions from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus, for unconditional life and self-realization, one has to worship the Supreme Lord under the direction of the Spiritual Master. Om Jnanatimurandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare, Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare, Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Mukam karati vachalam bhungam gayate grim yat kripaham tavam deshi krutina tiratharvan bharvanam maudam shichit. Hare Krishna. So we're continuing our discussion on the universal form of the Lord and how He's from His body is creating the Varnas, the Brahmana class, the Kshatriya class, the Vaishya class and the Shudra class. And yesterday we heard from Bhava Vibhushan Prabhu, who highlighted this one point Prabhupada highlights in the purport, that all of these Varnas are meant for service to the Lord. They're meant to satisfy the Lord. Not just that the Sudras are meant for service. All the four Varnas are meant to work in tandem or in conjunction, cooperating with one another to serve the Lord. And 2 classes ago, the verse quoted is Varnashma Charvatar Purushena Puman Vishnu Arajite Panta Natatosha Karana Say it again. Nanyat tattosya karanat. That from Vishnu Puran it's mentioned that the whole purpose of the Varnashrama Charavatar, the whole purpose of Varnashram Dharma is to satisfy the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And yesterday also Bhagavatam was quoted again, Atapumbi Tvija Shreshta Varnashrama Charavatar Purushena Parapuma Tvija Shreshta Varnashrama Charavatar. Am I mixing? Okay, it's mixing. Anyway, so Bhagavatam, first canto, second chapter, Sutta Goswami mentions that the whole purpose of Varnashrama Dharma is Samsiddhir Haritoshanam. The whole point is to serve and please the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. If you look at it from the Vedic perspective in terms of a gradual progression from materialistic life all the way up until transcendental life, the whole purpose of the Varnashram Dharma is to bring one from the point of animal life all the way up until the point to human civilization, Varnashram Dharma. And then when one meets the bona fide spiritual master and gets initiated, then one gets entrance into the transcendental sphere of living. So Prabhupada often mentions that ahara nidya bhayamaitunam cha, ahara nidra bhayamaitunam cha, samanametad purusham, samanametad pasubi naranam. That one who is simply engaged in ahara nidra and bhaya, that's eating, sleeping, mating and defending, they're in the animal form of life. And if a human being is simply engaged in these four activities, then they are also in the form of humans, simply animals. Animals in the form of human beings. And I'll come to this, but I'll just touch on it now, that even in spiritual life, we somehow or other bring this tendency in. And it's mentioned in Srimad Bhagavatam by Sukadev Goswami that when people go, those who think that their place of worship, place of birth is worshipable, their nation is worshipable, those who think that by going to the Ganges simply to take bath is the most important thing, those persons are no different from hogs and asses. What is that verse? I can't remember. But Prabhupada often quotes this one. This one is a very interesting verse because it teaches us that even the basic, way of living of the, Prabhupada says subhuman life or animalistic life sort of breaks into spiritual life over a period of time if one is complacent. That the whole purpose of going to the holy places is to hear from the saintly persons. But unfortunately people, they perform materialistic activities, ahara nidra bhayamaitunam cha, eating, sleeping, mating and defending. And all of their activities are simply gauged, or rather all their activities are aimed for sense gratification. And they'll enjoy and suffer accordingly. And when they suffer, they think, okay, let me get rid of this bad karma by taking advantage of these spiritual activities like taking bath in Ganga. So they'll go to Ganga, Hardwar, they'll go to Mayapur Dham, they'll go to different places just to take shelter of Ganga Mai. But of course, taking shelter of Ganga Mai, that's a very elevated position because you recognize Mother Ganga's position. But the mentality is contaminated. That's what's being highlighted here. Not the fact that they're taking shelter of Mother Ganga, but rather the contamination of consciousness that I will use Mother Ganga for my own sense gratification. Because why does one want to give up the bad karma? So that they don't suffer. But they don't go to Mother Ganga to give up their good karma. They don't go to Mother Ganga to give up good activities, to give up the good reactions as well, for the pleasure of Mother Ganga and the Supreme Lord. It's one-sided, so in that sense it's not pure, it's adulterated. As Prabhupada said, it's not unalloyed, it's alloyed, it's mixed. So then, what's the tendency? That if I take bath in the Ganga, then all my sins will be cleared. But Prabhupada mentions that, even I think Sutta Goswami or Sonaka Rishi mentions that when one takes bath in Ganga, the effect comes after a prolonged period of time. One must continuously take bath in Ganga. But one who approaches the devotee and takes shelter of the devotee, for them immediately they are purified. Because simply by hearing process, then the heart is cleansed. The contamination within the heart is cleansed. By association of that devotee, then naturally one realizes the contamination in one's heart, and one is, in one sense, transformed into becoming a pure-hearted soul. But this transformation is more to do with a cleansing of the heart. Because Nitya Siddha Krishna Prem Sadhya Kabinoy, Ye Krishna Siddha Krishna Prem Sadhya Kabinoy, Shavanadi Shuddha Chittesh Kare Udoy. That by the hearing process, see, Krishna consciousness is dormant within the heart. Just like Prabhupada gives the example, when a living entity takes birth, for example, a human child, when that child grows up and starts to walk, Prabhupada said it's a dormant propensity within the child to walk. That urges the child to walk. It's already there. In the same way, within the heart of all living entities, the love of Godhead is present, but it's covered, it's contaminated, it's covered, and our consciousness has become contaminated to the extent that we are expressing that desire for material enjoyment. But Shavanadi Shuddha Chitte Kare Udoy. Udoy means to rise, like the sunrise. So when one hears Shavanadi Shuddha Chitte, when one hears and one's heart becomes purified, Kare Udoy, that this Nitya Siddha Krishna Prem, this Krishna Prem rises within the heart. It's also mentioned when one chants the holy name in a similar case in the 6th canto. Sukadeva Goswami explains to Parikshit Maharaj that when one chants the holy name of the Lord, then just like when the sun comes up, the fog disappears. Similarly, the contaminations and the misconceptions within the heart, simply by chanting the holy name, one can recognize oneself again, one's original position as the servant of the Lord. So that's the transcendental state. And how does Varnashram Dharma allow you to get there? From this gross materialistic conception of life, of just satisfying the senses, all the way to using the senses as tools for Krishna's service. It's a gradual progression, from going from the Varnas gradually up. That's a general process the Vedic culture gives, that one takes birth as a Shudra, and when one performs that activities properly, then one takes birth as a Vaishya, and so on and so forth, until one takes birth as a Brahmana, and then perfects one's life by maybe taking shelter in a higher planetary system, and then hopefully by the mercy of Lord Brahma, one then elevates himself at the end of Brahma's day back home, back to Godhead. A very basic or a general path of progressive transcendental realization. But you see, the whole purpose of the Varnashrama is to engage the senses in the Lord's service. The ashrama gives the shelter by which one can practice devotional service or practice their varna in a very regulated way. If you see in this day and age, if one is not situated in an ashram very steadily, one's mind becomes very, very agitated very easily. Because when one is situated in an ashram, responsibility is there. One must meet the responsibilities of that particular ashram. And by meeting the responsibilities, one becomes regulated in one's activities. Shri Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan Ki Jai. And being regulated means that one is under the guidance of the spiritual master. It's a very important point to remember, that ashram is something that allows us to practice our Krishna consciousness in a very peaceful state of consciousness. Because by those rules and regulations, they become the pathway to freedom. And they are governed by the spiritual master, of course. So that is the ashram side, and we haven't touched on the ashram side in the Bhagavatam yet. What we're touching on is the varnas, the occupational duties, what activities one performs so that one is able to become liberated from dharma, artha, kama, and then moksha. Okay, so Prabhupada's mentioning here in the first section of the purport that the whole purpose, the Lord manifests all of these things, the living entities and all the different body parts of the Lord. They are all, the living entities are manifested, Prabhupada says, from the different parts of the body of the Lord, and are therefore meant to be eternal servitors of the Lord. And that brings us to the example that Narad Muni gives to King Prachina Barhi, or I think it's the Prachetas, that the watering of the tree, we water the root of the tree, not the leaves of the tree. Because by watering the root of the tree, automatically all the leaves and branches are nourished. By giving food to the mouth and not to any other orifice or hole in the body, we are satisfying the body because it's going straight to the stomach. And the stomach nourishes the body by digesting. So similarly, by serving the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then everyone is satisfied. Yasmin tushta jagat tushta. Just by serving and pleasing Krishna, then naturally the whole world is pleased. And that example is given by Draupadi and the Pandavas in the forest. The Akshaya Patra. That when Durvasa Muni visited Duryodhana in the palace of Hastinapur, then Duryodhana pleased Durvasa Muni. And Duryodhana, being a wicked-minded person, took the opportunity to take a boon from Durvasa Muni and asked Durvasa Muni to please go and visit the Pandavas in the forest while they were in exile. And he knew at this particular point in time the Pandavas would have finished their taking their prasadam. And of course everyone knew of the Akshaya Patra. Even Duryodhana knew of the Akshaya Patra. And Duryodhana, of course, another source of envy for him. So he knew that after Draupadi would have eaten, it would have finished its inexhaustible supply of food. So therefore, he sent Durvasa Muni at that particular point in time. And when Durvasa Muni appeared in front of the Pandavas, he told the Pandavas, along with his disciples, he told the Pandavas that I've come here, and they receive Durvasa Muni, and Durvasa Muni says, we'll come back, we'll just take bath in the Ganga, and we'll come there. And it's by natural etiquette that when a guest comes, especially a saintly person, that one offers food, a sitting place, water, so on and so forth, good word, at least some nice words. So then when Durvasa Muni went to take a bath with his disciples, then Yudhishthira Maharaj immediately hurried and asked Draupadi to prepare the Akshaya Patra. But then Draupadi had told Yudhishthira Maharaj that actually she had already finished. The Akshaya Patra would not produce food after Draupadi had finished her prasadam. So then in that condition, Draupadi and the Pandavas remembered Lord Krishna. And Lord Krishna, as Narad Muni says to Yudhishthira Maharaj later in the 7th canto, that they were sneha bandhat. They were the Supreme Personality of Godhead was so wrapped up or bound by the love of the Pandavas that the Supreme Personality of Godhead would always appear in front of the Pandavas. He would always be concerned about the Pandavas. In fact, when you see the progression of how Krishna enters into Dwarka, when Krishna kills Kamsa, and then he goes to Gurukul, comes back, and then he meets Akrura. When he goes to meet Akrura, then as Akrura receives him and glorifies him, Krishna is very pleased with Akrura. But then what does he tell Akrura to do? He tells him to go to Hastinapur, to go and see how the Pandavas are doing, because they are now lost their father and that they are in a very difficult position. And when Akrura visits Hastinapur at that particular point in time, then even Queen Kunti, she highlights that point, that Krishna still remembers them. She cries in her ecstatic lamentation that, who will take care of this? Other than Krishna, there's no one else to take care of us and this fatherless children of Pandu. So Akrura goes there, and you can see Krishna is always considering his devotees, always very attentive to his devotees' needs. So anyway, Krishna appears in the scene in this forest, and then he tells Draupadi to give the Akshaya Patra, and Draupadi says, I have finished, there's nothing left. And he says, still give it to me. So then when she gives it to him, Krishna finds a grain of rice still stuck to the Akshaya Patra. So then when Krishna eats that, being fully satisfied, then the whole world is satisfied. And the disciples of Durvasa Muni and himself, while taking bath in the river, they immediately feel full. They burped. And they immediately felt embarrassed and scared that if they appeared before Yudhishthira Maharaj and did not eat, then that would be considered an offense. So they immediately left that place. So you can see that by simply serving and pleasing Krishna, that is all that's required. And serving and pleasing Krishna is very easy. We just simply follow the instructions of the spiritual master. Because unfortunately, life after life, we have neglected or ignored the instructions of the Antaryami, or the spiritual master from within, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And because we've constantly ignored and cast aside these instructions of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, we have come to the state where we've conditioned ourselves to ignore what the Supersoul tells us within the heart. And layers and layers and layers of conditioning has come to extent that we no longer choose to hear the Supreme Personality of Godhead. We can't. And even if we are able to hear, we're not able to discern whether it's our mind, intelligence, or the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That's Maya's speciality, Avaranatmika and Pakshamatmika. That she drags us down, she covers us and then drags us down so we can't go back to our original position. What's the point of dragging down? If you just cover and uncover, then you'll know your original position. But Maya drags you through so many species of life, you forget what you are, where you are, what you're doing in life. So then, once that happens, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, being extremely merciful, sends His pure devotee as His external representation, the spiritual master. And by hearing and practicing devotional service, by surrendering to the spiritual master, it's no different from hearing the Antaryami from within the heart. And gradually, one cleanses the heart of the contaminations and conditionings, that one is able to take and hear the direct instructions of the spiritual master from within. But if you think of it very carefully, our position in devotional service is we're so fortunate that if you want to hear the Antaryami, you just simply take the Vani of the spiritual master. That's enough. That's our position in devotional service. We just simply hear from the spiritual master, and you can take it from granted that it's the Antaryami speaking. Because the spiritual master is a representative of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Shakshat Dharitvena Samastra Sastra. Just simply hearing from the spiritual master is equivalent as hearing from the Super Soul from within. So, by serving the Supreme Personality of Godhead, under the guidance of the spiritual master, then one is able to please everyone. Now, the whole purpose of the hands, the reason why I came to this point is the whole purpose of the hands, legs, all the limbs of the body, they're supposed to work together to feed the stomach if they want to become nourished. Similarly, if we use these senses that Krishna has given us, we'll naturally be satisfied. We'll naturally become satisfied. Just as the leaves, the branches, the twigs are satisfied simply by watering the root, simply by serving Krishna, we'll naturally become satisfied. But this is the biggest obstacle in our devotional service, that we lack faith in the simple principle of surrender unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead. We lack the faith and dedication to shut down the plan-making factory within our mind. Because every time we come in contact with the objects of senses, the mind begins calculating how to engage and how to enjoy. But unfortunately, we take a long time to shut that down and take shelter of Krishna's instructions, take shelter of the spiritual master's instructions, take shelter of Krishna himself. And that degree of surrender is what unfortunately or fortunately determines how satisfied we are in life. The more and more sheltered and surrendered we are at the lotus feet of Sri Guru and Gauranga, the more and more we'll experience the bliss of devotional service. The less, or to the degree in which we surrender to the Guru and to Krishna, to that degree we'll taste the nectar of devotional service. And that's a very crucial point, because you see, I somehow or other, it's become such a strong impression in my consciousness, but I remember reading how Pankajangri Prabhu was answering a question to one devotee in Mayapur, that this is Radha Shyam Sundar's, right, Radha Madhava's right there, the Ashtashakis are there. Why are you dedicating all your time to serving Nrsingadev? And Pankajangri Prabhu mentioned, he's mentioning exactly what I believe Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu or Rupa Goswami is mentioning, that, no, actually Prahlad Maharaj is mentioning, that who can actually approach Shri Radha Krishna, Shri Radha Gopinath directly? It is not possible for a living entity to directly approach the divine couple. Because the way pure devotees work is by serving Radha Krishna, despite all obstacles, they engage in their service wholeheartedly and determinedly. They don't let go for a moment. If you think about it, in our devotional service, when an obstacle comes, there's that point of hesitation. the point of what's going to happen next, that point of, that feeling of, oh man, the next step I take, distress will come. And that flinch, we flinch. Flinch is like, when you go towards someone and you're, about to punch them, or for example, when you're somewhere and something comes in between your eyes, you flinch, your eyes close for a moment. Unflinching devotional service means that in the presence of disturbing circumstances, your devotional service doesn't waver. That's unflinching devotional service. But we flinch, unfortunately. When negative situations happen, we don't immediately take shelter of Krishna. Neither do we, let me take a step back, I'll reword that. We're not able to use that situation in Krishna, we're not able to turn the tables around and use it in Krishna's service. What to speak of taking shelter of Krishna at that period of time. Because the pure devotees are able to immediately take shelter and reverse the situation for Krishna's pleasure. Radhachan Prabhu often mentions that the devotees, the sannyasis, those who have given up material desires, for them, whenever Maya tempts them, they take pleasure in saying no to Maya. Think about it. It's a very deep statement, because when we are tempted by Maya, we think, should I do it, should I not do it? Should I do it, should I not do it? If I do it, it'll be like this. If I don't do it, like that. If I do it, Krishna will understand, it's fine. And we progress down that path. But when it does come, we always feel like, man, why does it come? Why am I suffering in devotional service? I gave up all of these things hoping that Krishna, I'll be able to enjoy life and be peaceful and happy. But why is this happening to me? Whereas the devotees, as soon as that process of thought or that temptation of Maya comes into the picture, they take pleasure in saying no. And how do they take pleasure in saying no? They engage in devotional service even more, with more vigor, with more enthusiasm. That's how they say no to Maya. And for them, that's enjoyment. That is our source of enjoyment and happiness. Because, why? Because we know if we engage in devotional service, Krishna will be pleased, and naturally I will also be pleased. The gopis exemplify this to the topmost degree, because their whole concern was Krishna's pleasure. Their concern was that nothing about my senses. And Srimati Radharani exemplifies that, wherein she says at the end of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, it's a very intimate or a very confidential understanding, but Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, author Kaviraj Goswami has given it to us, that the mood of Srimati Radharani was that if another gopi is pleasing Krishna, then I will take the role of that maidservant, of a maidservant of that gopi, and bring her towards Krishna for his pleasure. Because Srimati Radharani's mood is that not my senses, Krishna's senses. If Krishna's happiness is my distress, I will take that as my happiness. But if Krishna's, so vice versa. If Shri Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan Ki Jai. So that is that's the nature of pure unalloyed devotional service on the topmost levels. That one is simply engaged in service for Krishna's pleasure, Krishna's senses. So basically coming back, the whole point is to serve Krishna's senses. And one who is unflinching in their devotional service. So Pankajanga Prabhu was mentioning that if one worships Nrsingadev, because unfortunately we're not on that platform, devotional service to the Lordship Shri Shri Radha Gopinath, whenever distractions come, it takes us away from Krishna's service. It makes it very difficult for us at our level of Krishna consciousness to continuously serve the Lord. Whereas pure devotees take those obstacles as stepping stones to go closer and closer to Radha Gopinath's service. So therefore, for those in the convalescent stage or the neophyte stage of devotional service, Pankajanga Prabhu mentions by worshipping Lord Nrsingadev, Nrsingadev's thunderbolt-like nails and teeth will rip apart these obstacles in our devotional service, and he will help us take shelter of Radha Gopinath more easily. So therefore, we take shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead so that we engage our senses in his service. Because sarvapadi vinirmuktam tatparatvena nirmalam rishikena rishikesha sevanam bhaktir uchyate, that by engaging the senses in Krishna's service, that is known as devotional service. So that is bhakti. So that is our constitutional position. But unfortunately, because we become contaminated by ahara, nidra, bhayam, by eating, sleeping, mating and defending, we have degraded or demoted ourselves from the human platform to the subhuman platform. In the subhuman life, the living entities are not conscious of this constitutional position, that is being servant of the Lord, but in the human form of life, they are supposed to know this through the system of the varnas, the social orders. So this whole varnashram dharma is supposed to bring us to the human form of life. Prabhupada often mentions by taking initiation is the beginning. Following the four regulative principles brings us to the human standard of life. But by chanting Hare Krishna, that's what spiritualizes us. That's what makes us come to the platform of serving the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So this Varnashram Dharma you can understand as the rules and regulations. They are the tracks that help us get to the destination. If we slightly deviate from the tracks, you can understand there'll be great chaos and calamity awaiting us at the end of our journey. Prabhupada says spiritual life is like a razor. We're walking on a razor's edge. And one slight slip or mistake, it will cut. It will cause a lot of harm and damage. So therefore, what do? You try and avoid it to the best of your ability by strictly following the process of devotional service. But Prabhupada says, failure is a pillar of success. If you slip, if you trip, if you get cut, Prabhupada says you should try, and then you get up and must try again. We must keep trying in devotional service. Of course, our situation won't be the same because there's a difference between knowingly getting cut and unknowingly getting cut. For those who knowingly who get cut knowingly, knowing that this choice that I make is going to take me away from Krishna, but I'll still take it. For them, they will not. Their facility, their situation of devotional service will change. It will change. And it will change to match the mentality or the attitude of that devotee. Because Krishna gives facility for devotional service. But if he sees that facility is taking away a devotee from his service, then he'll take that facility away from that person. So then what will happen? By gradually practicing devotional service, again the devotee will again become reinstated. And then Krishna will then give that facility for that devotee to perform devotional service. So we try and try again. We don't take advantage of Krishna's mercy. Rather, we take advantage of the opportunity to perform devotional service, although we're not qualified. That is how we take advantage of Krishna's mercy. We're not qualified, but Krishna is giving us the service, so therefore we'll take that advantage. Not that we are not qualified, we'll engage in sense gratification, and Krishna's mercy will somehow or others pull us out of it. So the mentality should be unalloyed. It should be free from this contamination of sense gratification. So that's the first section of the purport. The second section talks about this conditioned life, unfortunately of sense gratification to the topmost degree of contamination, where one thinks that he is the supreme. And you'll see this Mayavad philosophy, Prabhupada's refutation has been dotted throughout this chapter. When Prabhupada talks about the false ego, Prabhupada's talking about the topmost level or contamination of false ego is when one thinks oneself to be the supreme. And then in between this verse and the previous verse, Prabhupada also talks about that the mentality or the wanting of false ego, thinking oneself the body, the end or the last snare of Maya is that one thinks oneself to be the supreme. And this Mayavadi tendency, the reason why Prabhupada calls this, or rather the Acharyas call this Mayavada, is because when one thinks oneself to be the supreme, one is illusioned. Because if one is supreme, why is one conditioned? Why is Maya more powerful than the supreme living entity? That means Maya is more powerful than the supreme. Therefore Mayavada, the doctrine of illusion. Because one then thinks that Maya, if one thinks oneself to be the supreme, then by logic, their philosophy is that Maya is more supreme than themselves. Therefore Maya is supreme, Mayavad. So this Mayavadic tendency is present within every living entity in this material world. If Prabhupada says the last snare of Maya is one to think of, is that one thinks he's the supreme, then we must take it to heart and be very careful. Because if it's the last snare of Maya, then it's the most difficult thing to overcome. The last snare of Maya means that one may have given up so many things of sense gratification in this material world. To the extent Prabhupada explains that when one performs Ashtanga Yoga, one sees the Paramatma. To be able to see a Paramatma is not an ordinary feat. To be able to see the Paramatma, one must have attained Samadhi, complete absorption in seeing and remembering the Lord. And when one gets to Samadhi and one's able to see the Paramatma, what is the risk in that? And the risk there is that one may think that I am that Paramatma. So you can see living entities have given up so much. They've come to the last stage of spiritual practice, but still they're liable to falling down because of that last snare of Maya, thinking oneself to be the supreme. So we must take that even more cautiously. You see, we should become like Dhruva Maharaj. Dhruva Maharaj, he was so fixed in his devotional service that when the Vishnudutas came to get him, that he finished performing his devotional service, took shelter of all the Vaishnavas and the sages there, and then took a step on the head of death before entering into the plane, Vaikuntha plane. It's mentioned that when one enters the Vaikuntha plane, sometimes they take you around the whole universe. And when they take you around the universe, then you have to be very careful. Because if you think, oh, that place looks very good, it's kind of like immediately you get beamed down into that particular situation of life, finished. By the time you realize it, the Vaikuntha plane is already gone. You've missed it. So our mood or our devotional service should be so fixed and regulated, and it is supported by the varnas and the ashramas to the extent that at the end of life we know what we want. We don't want anything else except the service of the Lord. That's all we want. Even if Maya presents herself in such a way that here's an opportunity to become Krishna. In fact, Maya will present herself as Krishna in one sense. Still we'll be able to discriminate that this is not Krishna, this is an illusion, and take shelter of Krishna directly. So the actual position of the conditioned soul is explained in this verse. All conditioned souls are impure due to contact with material energy in the three modes of material nature. Karnam guna sangasya sadasat yoni janmasu. Therefore it is necessary that they purify themselves under the guidance of the bona fide spiritual master. So in this verse we are touching on two things. One is that the whole purpose of these varnas is to engage with faith and devotion under the guidance of the spiritual master for purifying oneself through these occupational duties and pleasing the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And that is the core crux of this verse. Purifying oneself through the Varnashrama under the guidance of the spiritual master. And it all lies, our whole spiritual life comes down to this surrender principle. To the degree we surrender, ye yata mam prapadyate tam satevi bhajamyaham, to that degree we'll experience spiritual life. Krishna is so kind that if you have Prabhupada says this, Krishna is so kind that even if you have an ounce or a tinge of material desire, he'll give you a body to satisfy it. Because Krishna is, in one sense, very picky, but Krishna is very sensitive. Krishna doesn't want to force himself upon the living entity. Krishna wants the living entity to voluntarily come and take shelter of him wholeheartedly. So if Krishna gives pure devotional service to someone who doesn't want it, they'll take it as burden. And Krishna is so sensitive, and Krishna doesn't want the living entity to minimize devotional service, but at the same time doesn't want to cause inconvenience to the living entity by forcing himself. Krishna waits patiently for the living entity to voluntarily take shelter of him. But Krishna's patiently waiting is not some inactivity. Krishna's patiently waiting is that he comes as a spiritual master. Krishna's patiently waiting is that he sends his devotees. Krishna's patiently waiting comes to the extent that he comes as Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, as a devotee himself, to preach Krishna consciousness. And Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's patiently waiting is that he gave up his Navadip pastimes to take sannyas so that people would be able to take shelter of him and go home back to Godhead rather than blaspheming him. So Krishna is taking all attempts, endeavors, all risks, all efforts to come to make himself easily accessible to living entities. But I was reading recently in Krishna's fight with Shiva and Banasur. Shiva says that this human form of life is so fortunate that if one is able to take to devotional service, but if one does not take to devotional service, is no better than an animal. Because all other forms of life don't allow you to take to devotional service so easily. Whereas the human form of life, it's extremely rare and very easy to take to devotional service. And then Shiva says to Krishna that actually you are the supreme friend, you are the worshipable Lord, and you are the most dear to all living entities. He says that in 2 verses, one after the other. These 3 things. You're the best friend, you're the most dear, So Sruhit, Priya, and Ishvara. You are the worshipable Lord. So Shiva is mentioning that those, even the demigods mention, those who don't take to devotional service with this human form of life, they are unfortunate, they are most fallen. So therefore it is our duty, now that we have come to devotional service, Prabhupada will take care of us. As Prabhupada says in that lecture, I think it's in Melbourne, where Prabhupada says that if one takes to devotional service, one's life is 50% liberated, I think something like that. Do you remember? Oh, okay. In one place Prabhupada says that, to the extent that when Prabhupada leaves, he says 75% one is liberated. And all the devotees still, they're not very enthusiastic. They say Jai Prabhupada, but they still feel. And Prabhupada then tells that, don't worry, I have the key. I have the key to the back door, just hold on to my dhoti. So we are already here in Krishna consciousness. We simply have to follow what Prabhupada's given us. That way we'll hold on to Prabhupada's dhoti. But what is required of us is that we must go out and bring everyone else to devotional service. I think it's Tukaram Maharaj. It's mentioned that this Tukaram, when he was leaving the world, when he was leaving, he saw everyone there, the people that he was leaving, disciples that he was leaving. And then he told the Lord, 1 second, I just need to go get my veena. I think it was veena or sitar, some instrument. And he went to get it down. And when he went to get it, then he told all his disciples to hold on. And so as he went back to Godhead, each one of his disciples, one holding each other, holding on to the instrument, they all went back home with Tukaram Maharaj. So the mood of the devotee is to bring as many living entities back home, back to Godhead. Because that is the best way to please the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So all of these varnas, we perform these activities under the guidance of the spiritual master, so that we'll be able to please the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And that's the purpose, to please the Supreme Personality of Godhead. We shouldn't get so absorbed in performing our duties that we forget that the whole purpose is to please Krishna. Because if we forget the whole purpose is to please Radha Gopinath, then it'll become, what's in it for me? Name, fame, puja, labha, pratishtha. And then even more gross, what comes from it, What will satisfy my belly, what will satisfy all my senses? How can I use it for engaging my service, in my service of my senses? So, Maitreya Rishi is emphasizing this point, that these social divisions are born simply for the purpose of serving the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So I'll end here. Are there any comments, questions? Yes, Prabhu.
The Varnashram system that we were talking about earlier, about the Shudra affecting the Sujis, taking over the Kshatriya.
Yep.
What sort of Varnashram system do you have? I don't know if it's very Varnashram.
It's Varnashram Dharma. The whole point is that when one performs in that mode of transcendental progression, or that particular path, then one gradually elevates one's consciousness from that of being absorbed in the mode of ignorance to the Purna mode of goodness. And the Varnashram is kind of like a stick that helps that plant grow.
So that type of Varnashram that wants to progress gradually, is the goal of that Varnashram system moksha, or is it Vishnu?
The whole purpose of Varnashram Dharma is to serve and please Krishna. But unfortunately, that particular living entity that takes that slow process, for them to understand that, they have to go through that whole process.
So in the daily Varnashram system, the Shudra worship Vishnu and pure devotee, you still have to take birth as a Vaishya.
Of course not. That's Devi Varnashram.
So I'm just trying to understand, so what is the goal for people with that Varnashram system which forces them to gradually do this?
I think I have to come back to that point of one's sense gratification. When one is in the mode of ignorance, then it's just simply performing the duties to satisfy one's senses. And at least they perform their duty properly. Right? And by performing the duty properly, then they gradually become more purified to be able to then take up the next process, the next process, the next process. Yes, you can say in that sense the goal is moksha. Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. That's the progressive stage in that. And gradually when one comes to the Brahmanical point of life, then that's the springboard into transcendental life, transcendental sphere. When one performs their particular varna and the Devi Varnashram Dharma, regardless of where one's at, it's already directly connected to Krishna through the spiritual master. But going through this long process of Sudra, Vaishya, Kshatriya, Brahmana, the devotional service is not the core essence of their practice. Because if devotional service is the core essence, they don't have to go through that progressive stage of evolution. They'll immediately liberate themselves. Leading to moksha. Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Yeah, okay.
You were mentioning about confidence, worshiping Krishna, that we're not qualified to destroy Krishna, but Krishna will destroy our lives, that's our belief. So, Prabhupada was just said, first is that. So, what sort of qualification do you want to reach to be able to approach the worship of Krishna?
What is the qualification? Well, our process is Vaidhi Bhakti, and that transforms to Raganuga Bhakti, right? So, our qualification is whatever Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has given us. For us, right now, we just simply engage in Mahaprabhu's Sankirtan mission. That's it. We don't have to worry about becoming qualified to worship Radha Krishna. We're serving them automatically by taking shelter of Mahaprabhu in the mood of Dasya Bhav. So, if you want to directly approach Radha and Krishna, no one can approach Krishna directly. It's always through the service, through the Vaishnavas. Our worship of Radha Krishna is always in the mood of, I'm just simply serving my spiritual master, who's serving his spiritual master, who's serving his spiritual master, and that's going all the way to Lalita Sakhi, and then to Srimati Radharani, and then to Krishna. There's never a stage where we directly worship Radha and Krishna. What Pankajangri Prabhu was mentioning is that those who are dedicated to worshipping the deities of Radha and Krishna, it's a very strict process. Obstacles will come. But because of one's level of devotion to the Lord is not very strong, to worship Radha and Krishna like that, then it's very difficult. Because as soon as obstacle comes, then one will slack in devotional service because of a lack of faith. Because when worshipping the Lord, these obstacles just simply enhance that worship. Obstacles just simply allow one to take more and more shelter of Radha and Gopinath. But if one's devotion is very weak, when the obstacle comes, then they make the offense that what's the worst point of worshipping Radha Krishna if these obstacles are coming, just let me give it up. For such persons of that mentality, which is people who come to devotional service, for them to worship Radha and Krishna directly, they'll more than likely commit offenses. So therefore, by serving Nrsingadev, serving the spiritual master, one then gets rid of all these obstacles, and then one is able to engage in the service